Hi, I'm Peter McNamara and I'm one of the co-artistic directors of the Sideband collective. And I'm here today in the old St Thomas Chapel in Narellan in southwestern Sydney with one of the composers from our latest album, From the Depths, Sarah Elise Thompson. Sarah, thank you very much for talking with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, when Brad approached...
Chloe's just come through.
Chloe, I'm in an interview.
So, Sarah, in 2016, Sideband commissioned you to write a new composition for vibraphone and pre-recorded electronics for my colleague Brad Gill to perform. And for the inspiration of that particular piece, you decided to delve back into your childhood. Can you tell us a bit about that?
I had no idea where to start when it came for a piece for vibraphone and electronics, and the one thing that kept me grounded in the first little part of the writing process was I was in my room and I locked the door and it was like, no one can come in. I need to find inspiration somehow. You know how that is, composers watching. Anyway, I found all these old music boxes in my room, which were all different family members of mine who are no longer with me, and they're all throughout my bedroom, and I just started recording them on my iPhone and putting them into my laptop and trying to find out what sounds they were making, and started manipulating them in Logic. And what I found out is the melodic material in all of those old music boxes were all quite hypnotic and very spooky almost, but yet they were also really sweet to kind of throw together. There was kind of a story that kind of came through with it. And so when I was writing the vibraphone part on top of it, it kind of just felt like me exploring and playing with these music boxes again. When you hear the melody part of the vibraphone, it's almost like you're trying to delve in into the music box yourself and find the sound. So
all of those music boxes that you had, they were from family members, is that correct?
Yeah. The oldest one is from 1870, I found out. And
wow.
It's my great-grandmother's, I found out. And it was really important for me too to sample popular pieces too, because that's my foundation. I started as a pop artist and in bands and stuff, and then coming into contemporary classical land. When this piece landed on my plate, I had no experience in writing for a solo instrument and electronics, let alone composing in a classical style. It was a way for me to approach the instrument in a way that could be familiar to me, but then I also could start delving into these techniques that my teachers started giving me advice about. One of my teachers at the time that I was learning with is Jerry Brophy, and he was encouraging me to dive into Sciarrino scores and start diving into the repertoire that had gone in the contemporary classical kind of world. And those names sounded so crazy to me. I had no idea what I was doing, but I did still use my foundation of where I came from and then my family's music boxes and tied that in together with a bit of contemporary classical, and then we got the music box, I think.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you mentioned your background in popular music. That I think relates well to my next question. Yeah, so Sarah, in your composition, there is quite a lot of freedom that you give the performer. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
I definitely think using improv as a part of this piece was a massive reason why I included it from my background. Every piece I write comes from voice memos or me playing on the piano or singing and improvising that way. And I was never really used to the traditional score model of writing down a fixed score for someone to go and play. I wanted to make something that had a little bit more freedom for the performer, just so that there was little elements of them every time they played it, and it wasn't a strictly one-take wonder, if you will. Brad and I had spent an extensive amount of time back in 2016 doing workshops of the piece together, and when we were doing all the workshopping, he was just sometimes playing for me for an hour, just random improvs that he was exploring at the time with some of the mallets we were using, and that was a massive part of how I started learning about the instrument. So when it came to finally sitting down and writing that, it just made sense for me to put improv within the work.
It is important that the performer has some input as well, quite often, particularly in new music. And it's been performed by someone other than Brad, is that correct?
Yeah. It's been really cool to see the work kind of end up in random pigeons of the new music community, both here and abroad. I was lucky enough to get the work premiered back a couple months after this one got premiered in 2017 by my friend Matt Steens, and he at the time was going to Peabody Conservatory in Baltimore. When I think of the music box, by the way, I think of Brad. Like, all the mallets, all the techniques, all the improvs, I couldn't hear it with someone else's voice attached to it. It had to be him. So then when I gave the score to someone else and they showed it for me, it was crazy. For the first time, I didn't hear Brad in it, I heard myself. And that's a really empowering moment in your early composition days to be like, hang on, I have a voice too. And like, no matter who plays it, like there's still a little bit of me in it.
And that segues quite nicely into my last question. So you mentioned some of those crazy techniques and the like that Brad uses in your work. A lot of these were developed both with myself and my other former sideband colleague Tristan Quello as well, some of these more interesting sounds. So tell us a little bit about those and why and how you've used them in your composition.
What was really great about writing this work was to find all these new techniques to put in my tool bag to go forward. And I think, if anything, there are so many techniques used in this work. It's rich in extended techniques. Just because as a young student, at the time I wrote this, I was in third year uni, second year, third year. When I was at that stage, I was just trying to figure out how sound works. And one of the quickest, easiest ways to find out how sound works is to just throw every technique possible at the instrument to try and find out how it works, but then also how to phrase it together. And I think that's where, when you listen to the other tracks on this album too, like with your works, Peter, and with Brad's works, they're very through-lined. You don't see the technique just put in an array. You use them for a specific sonic purpose, which for me, when I was writing this, it was more about, let's just find how the instrument works.
Yeah, and it's a very important part of being a composer, using extended techniques, not just for the sake of using extended techniques. And there are lots and lots of compositions out there that seemingly do just that. But I don't get that impression from your composition, by the way.
What's been really beautiful about this whole process, by the way, is Brad and Peter have walked me through the entire process from the start all the way to the end. And that's something that's so rare as a young composer, right? What we end up getting is sometimes you'll go to the first rehearsal of your work and then you have the premiere, and then it's kind of wrapped up at that stage until the performer re-engages with you. But you guys have just been so hands-on with me at such an early stage in my career too, where you've taken me through every workshop, hours of workshopping. You took me to 2 separate premieres at different venues, and then we went to the studio 2 years later and recorded it. And now we're here at Old St. Thomas Church, and we're doing a live stream of the recording of the album we just did. Like, that's so insane to even think of, like, a work can grow almost from 2016 to 2020. Yeah, I'm so grateful to you guys for giving me the chance to find my voice and develop as a composer over a longer period. I think also, by the way, this needs to be implemented a little bit more. There needs to be more, when you approach a composer, especially if they're a little bit younger, like having that little bit of leniency to walk them through and help them understand why they're writing it, and to go back and do the edits, but with a more cognizant sort of sense of, oh wait, I'm going to edit my piece because this is what's going to make it sound better in performance, or in the studio, we're going to edit this a lot quicker if you do this.
Yeah, you are welcome. We asked you to compose a piece for us because we thought you were very talented and we thought that you could do it. And there is really nothing worse than just premiering a piece and then it goes on to the contemporary music scrap heap. So, Sarah Elise Thompson, thank you very much for talking with me today.
Thank you. Guys, go check out From the Depths by Sideband, featuring my piece, The Music Box, as well as a bunch of other crazy cool works that you've got to check out.
So that was Sarah Elise Thompson's composition, The Music Box, performed there by Brad Gill. And we have Brad Gill here now, who's going to answer a few questions about his composition, which is coming up as our next featured track on our video. So Brad, hello there. How are you going?
Hello, I'm pretty well. How are you?
So let's move our topic on to your composition called Tomb, which is on the Sideband From the Depths album.
Mm-hmm.
So I've often heard you discuss how you often go walking through graveyards and you find that very, very peaceful and relaxing, and even wanting to put on performances in such venues. So, well, why this interest in death, and how does that relate to the title of your composition, Tomb?
It's not an interest in death per se. I mean, I've had a long-standing interest in Buddhist philosophy, and in more recent years, more concretely in the practice. And a large part of it is contemplation of death. It's the reality of life. You know, a cemetery, I don't know, for me it just feels light. It's a lightness. So I feel peaceful walking around. But yeah, in Australia, up until a certain point, cemeteries were places where people went on dates, picnics, family outings. It was like a real social, like the park is now. So it's not the case that it's always been sort of weird. Although my girlfriend's mum and sister think I'm pretty weird. I'm by no means at peace with the fact that there's a limit on the span of life that I have and we all have, but it's truth, and engaging with that can bring a lightness. But yeah, I had the notion of exploring the death poems, the Japanese death poems. For a while, I'd thought I'd set them like with a singer executing the text and with music, but instead I wanted to try something I've done in the past a few times, which is have the poems, because they're short, they're like a few lines, a haiku basically. I decided to have them embedded, well, in the score as points of, I suppose, inspiration, like the music somehow flows out or responds to those. But I actually was walking in Sutherland Shire Cemetery, very nice cemetery, and a poem just came into my mind fully formed. And I don't usually write poetry and so on, so it was a quite unusual experience. And it was literally in this sort of spirit of the Japanese, I guess, Imagist poems. Like it's not descriptive as such. It's just this now. But I was walking and I heard a crow beating its wings, and I walked past a spider web that was between some of the headstones, and that just almost literally became a poem. So yeah, the text that is in the score and which shapes it literally came out of a walk in the cemetery. A part of the piece is Webstreamed's Opus 27.
We'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
I've got another question.
Okay.
That I'm
Well,
going to use to
I'll mention
read that.
Tomb in relation to that too. I'll simply say that comes out of a piano piece, which is sort of, it's as if the pictures are stoned or entombed, if you will. Like there's no flexibility. It's like 12-note equal temperament. They're fixed. The sort of lifeness of them, or aliveness of the sound, is, to me, it's kind of like dead, if you will, as opposed to what we do in the piece, where there's microtonal and lots of sort of colors and fluctuations in the pitch material that aren't possible on the instrument that reference piece was written for.
Yeah, and Sutherland Shire Cemetery is down in Sydney's south, which is where two of my grandparents are also actually are also buried. So there's a close.
I didn't know that.
There's a close link for both of us there. And we haven't mentioned yet that Brad's composition Tomb is actually composed for a Chinese instrument called the ditsa, which is the Chinese transverse flute made from bamboo. And in his work, Brad plays vibraphone and some other percussion instruments as well. So next question. So the format of your composition Tomb is very, very free. And often I get in trouble off you for labeling such works that you've composed in the past as structured improvisations. But how would you actually describe the free nature of the piece and how it's actually realised as well?
I would describe it as an improvisation-based piece. I would argue it's less free than you perceive it. I mean, I've each of the performances are very different in some respects, but there's like a truth or a sort of consistency of voice through them.
Yes, there's definitely, you know, a number of sections where the material is quite consistent in its different realizations, and that's because you sort of partly notated it, I guess.
It's, I guess, finding a consistency of expression within what appears to be great freedom. And so for me, the process was steered by how do I write a piece for pizza and vibraphone that's true to both traditions without imposing one over the other. So, for example, there are a lot of concertos for Asian instruments with Western orchestras where there's this pentatonic stuff chucked in, like the material. I mean, that's not really writing something that brings the traditions together. The process was listen to Chloe Chung, the jitsu player who I've been collaborating with for this project. Listen to her demonstration of the various Chinese flutes repeatedly. I read her master's thesis and I listened to other examples, but came back to her own playing. And we'd also done a bit of experimenting with just playing over some poetry. Again, that was really conducive for me in shaping the piece, but for her, it was more conducive in shaping her performance of the piece. So we had sort of two parallel roadmaps, series of four poems and one line from a novel, actually, that ended the book, the final section. And then notated reference key points that was sort of like fulcrums for improvisation to steer towards and out of.
So moving on to our next question. So firstly, why the interest in Weber's Opus 27 piano variations? And how did you actually marry that interest in this sort of an atonal 12-tone theory work with a traditional Chinese instrument, the ditsa?
Interesting series of questions. I came to that piece due to a commission from Daniel Herskovich, which initiated an ongoing working relationship. The outcomes of the explorations I did suggest a whole lot of ideas. And when I first started experimenting with that, I would just hear some of the parts, and I started just hearing internally very clear quarter tones, equal tempered quarter tones, dead center between the notes on the piano. It became apparent really quickly after I'd sort of internalized the demonstrations and familiarized myself from Chloe with the instrument, the Chinese instrument, and I was improvising and just sort of listening to what came up. It became pretty apparent that treating the Webern seed material in some way as an outside, for me to respond to as a composer, but also for Chloe to respond to as an improviser, placed us both in the same position as outsiders to the seed of the work, which means that we both responded from our own musical perspectives together. And then everything that she played would change what I played, which is exactly what happened. The way that I play when I play this piece with her is very different to what I would usually do when I'm improvising. And it so happens that one of the structures that I created, which is, in this case, it's like a big scale, right, that goes from top to bottom of the vibraphone, but each note only appears in certain places. It's not like every note appears everywhere. One of those structures that becomes really important in the piece fits naturally the pattern that comes out of her flute. There's three of those rather on a ditsa that are really natural pentatonic scales, and yeah, it just fitted easily. Just all these sorts of coincidences worked as well. Like, I mean, one of the things that's really common in traditional Chinese music is an accelerating pattern of alternating notes that become a tremolo or just repeated notes. That kind of stuff is something I've been interested in exploring anyway. There are all sorts of synchronicities, not just superficially, but really get into understanding the spirit of musics that are outside of my own. So that's sort of how everything sort of fits together in relation to the Weber.
Yeah, it's certainly a topic that you've immersed yourself in over the years. So, Brad, thank you very much for your comments.
My pleasure.
On your composition tune. And we're going to hear Brad's composition tune now, performed by Brad Gill himself and also Chloe Chung on the ditsa.
A graveyard, autumn fireflies, 2 or 3.
Stumble, 4. Slide down the snowy slope.
Grave walk, a spider's loom, I hear beating wings.
Autumn breeze, plaintive cry of crow.
The light wove its way through the darkness like a discontinuous white thread, now there, now gone again.
So that was Brad Gill's piece called Tomb, and that was performed by Brad Gill himself and Chloe Chung playing the Chinese flute, the ditsa. We are lucky enough to have our next composer with us, and we're going to briefly talk to her before we listen to her composition called Orbit. So Kezia Yap, she's joining me from Melbourne. Kezia, welcome.
Hi, it's good to be here.
It's good to have you here. And Kezia is in the middle of the Melbourne lockdown at the moment. The border is going to be closed tonight, so Kezia is right in the middle of that situation at the moment.
Yeah, making sure to stay at home and not be too close to other people, but it's getting used to it very quickly.
Yeah, indeed, we've all had to get used to that over the last few months, haven't we? So Kezia, let's talk about your composition that's on the Sideband From the Depths album. So Orbit. So let's talk about the title first of all. So Brad Gill is the performer on our album for that particular composition of yours, and he finds that the main material, pitch material in your work, sort of orbits around a particular piece. But what do what do you feel is the relationship of the title to this particular work?
That's a really good question. So I gave the work the title Orbit because I imagined that there were a bunch of varying elements within the piece that were kind of orbiting something else in a way. So I think initially when I gave it the title Orbit, I was thinking a lot about the vibraphone and how it was used both live and in the electronics, and the way that the electronic sounds kind of move around the live vibraphone sounds as well, and kind of pick apart bits and then kind of reshape it or change the sounds, weaving the little melodic passages through the piece. I kind of thought about the pitches orbiting a central pitch as well, so kind of going up and down, from kind of having this really centered note and then really little kind of gestures coming out of it and moving around it. So that's the title. That's where it's come from.
Yeah, well, that makes perfect sense. That certainly is evident in the composition. So nothing celestial at all about the title. Is that correct?
Yeah, nothing too celestial, and more in terms of the movement and the gesture and the sound wall that's created.
Yeah. So Orbit wasn't commissioned by Sideband, and it wasn't written specifically for Brad. So how was the composition developed, and was there a particular performer in mind for that?
Yeah, so when I was working on this piece, it probably would have been 2014, I think, that I wrote it. So it's a while ago. And I was working really closely with a good percussionist friend of mine, Matt Levy. So after going to a concert, I became quite enamored with the idea of writing for solo vibraphone and the potential that the sound, like the really metallic sounds, have when processed through electronics. So I worked really closely with Matt to develop small musical gestures and ideas, then record those, put those into a sound processor. So I used Logic to experiment with the sounds, see what I could do with it, try different effects on it. And then the live part, the live elements of the work actually came out of the electronics. So I had the tape part set, and then I kind of wrote the live vibraphone part over that.
Yeah, and Matt Levy, of course, is down in Melbourne as well with Orchestra Victoria, I believe now. So very, very talented percussionist. So it's great to see him doing well down in Melbourne as well. So next question. So you talked a little bit about your approach, to the composition just in your answer there, but particularly I wanted you to enlighten us a bit more about how you explored interaction between the electronic component and the live component.
Sure. So interaction within music is something I've been really interested in over the last few years, and really exploring how interactions work within both live performance and within electronic and electroacoustic performance. There's such different kind of conversations to have talking about chamber music and talking about mixed music. So I was really interested after reading some papers and writings about how electroacoustic and mixed music can be so one-sided in terms of interaction. I was really interested in exploring how I could kind of link in the live elements and the electronic elements a little bit more seamlessly and more in a more interesting way, because I'd seen a lot of works where there was a tape part and just a live part put on top, and I wanted there to be more connection between. So the way that I've explored interaction in the piece, I think, is through the little recurring gestures that come in and out, constructing them in a way to create a conversation between the live performer and between the tape part as well.
Yeah, and that is definitely a very common problem with works that are with mixed media. I mean, you mentioned the term mixed media there. There's so many terms that we have for this type of composition. And it's funny that you talk about a tape part, yet it's completely digitally it's completely digitally realized. But often we're still calling this kind of medium tape and instrument music or something along those lines. So just on that point, I mean, I tend to use the term pre-recorded part now because it could be something that's digitally recorded. But with your pre-recorded part, it does have a very ethereal quality, I find, to it. And you gave us a little bit of insight before about how you developed those sounds that are on your pre-recorded part. But can you go into that a little bit more? What kind of processes and the like did you use to create those sounds?
Yeah, sure. So the vibraphone itself already lends itself to an ethereal soundscape so easily because of the metallic nature of the sound and because of the harmonics that naturally come out through the timbre. So I think a lot of my process in terms of working on the pre-recorded electronics or the tape part was to try a bunch of different plugins and things out on Logic. A lot of the time I was stretching the sound as well to create a really elongated kind of drone effect as well that I layered to create different kinds of textures. So when I kind of pulled the sounds apart, different rhythms could come out of the sounds depending on how far I stretched them. So putting those together, I was able to create a bunch of different textures that I could work with and at different kind of pitch and registers as well. It was one of my first kind of more serious electroacoustic or mixed music style works. And so it was a very experimental process for me. I sat around on Logic for hours, just trying out little things, moving things by millimeters, by milliseconds as well, just to see how things fit together and how even the smallest amount of change could, in terms of the editing, could make a huge change within the work itself and kind of drive the composition in a different direction.
Yeah, I mean, we could explore plugins for weeks on end, couldn't we, in Logic or any other particular program? But certainly granulation, as you mentioned there, so stretching out the sound is a very common technique for pre-recorded media. So it's something that's come up from the very first mixed media pieces, if that's how you like to describe them. All right, so Kezia, thank you very much for your time today and for answering our questions. Yeah, so we are going to hear Kezia's work, Orbit, now. And Kezia, also, good luck with your Melbourne lockdown and stay safe.
Thank you so much. Will do. You too.